My name is Rachel Rofe. I created the show because I wanted to help you see that if you have a choice, you can choose a better life. If you're listening to this podcast, you're in a pretty fortunate position. You have free will, ability to connect to the internet, and access to all kinds of new education. This podcast is meant to help you make the most of your good fortune. We talk with all kinds of people here from all walks of life because I want you to see that no matter what your situation, there's always a way to create a life that you're proud of. Hello. So today's episode is with Eric Zimmer, and he has a podcast called The One You Feed. In today's episode, we cover a bit of ground. So first we talk about just where Eric has come from, a little bit about his background to where he is now. His podcast is crazy successful. It's the best of 2014 podcast on iTunes. He has multiple companies. And then we geek out for a few minutes on podcasting. Don't worry, that goes by quickly. And then I figured I'd keep it in there, though, for those of you who are interested. And then we just talk about different things around all kinds of things, really. So just general awareness, what happens when negative thoughts come to mind. So there's people that it could be that you are one of these people that a negative thought will come and it just spins over and over and over for you. Or it can be where the reaction is instead to bypass it and say, oh no, everything is great. Or maybe, you do both, but we talk about that and kind of how to handle that when it happens and routine. And we just cover a bunch of different things. I think the episode goes pretty quickly. We share some stories to keep it interesting. And as always, I would love to hear what you think about the episode. So please let me know, Twitter, my blog, rachelrefay.com, or wherever. Let me know what you think, what you liked, maybe what you'd like to see more of. I'm open to all your feedback. All right, enjoy. Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel, for having me.
Absolutely. So the intention behind A Better Life is to show people that if they have a choice, that they can choose a better life. So in that spirit, can you take a few minutes to just brag and share some of the things that you're most proud of in your life?
Sure. It's an interesting word, proud of. It's a good word. It's just not one that I usually think about. But I guess if I had to say what I'm most proud of, I would probably say my son to start. He's 16, so that would probably be my most proud. But maybe a little bit about me and the things that I've done. I've been in software startup companies for most of my career, so I did probably 15 years in various software startup companies. I founded a solar energy company. Currently, I am the host of a podcast called The One You Feed, which is the thing that I'm most excited about. And I do some consulting work, e-commerce consulting work for different people. So that's kind of the things that I've been doing. But yeah, I think I'm most proud of my son, and I think maybe some of the podcasts we've done I'm pretty proud of.
Yeah, I have so much to ask around that because, you're saying now all these great things that you have going on. You have your son, these companies, your podcast, which I have some questions about just because I know you mentioned somewhere that you started off with no money, no audience. It ended up becoming best of 2014. So such great things. And before I go into questions about that, I would love to know, because I saw in another podcast interview that you did where you were sharing a little bit about, you've had some high highs and some low lows. And I know at one point you were living in a van and 50 pounds underweight. So can you just share a bit about that? Because I think it'll be really helpful for people just to get perspective on how much you've overcome to be where you are now.
Sure. I was, what you're describing, I was 24 years old and I had a pretty bad drug problem and was homeless. So I was living in the back of a crappy old van and, 50 pounds underweight because I was pretty much, dying from addiction. So I was 24 then. So it's been a long road since then. But yeah, that was the lowest of lows for sure.
And how did you start getting through that?
Well, I think I just ran out of any other options besides the one that said I've got to somehow find a way to get better. I wish I could. It wasn't a real high-minded desire that I suddenly wanted to lead a great life. I had taken that road as far as it was going to go, and I think there were only 2 points left for me. It was either jail or dead, and I somehow got to the point where I was willing to try and avoid both those things. And so I just got involved in my recovery and spent a lot of work and time and energy to kind of get past that.
Huh, yeah, I mean, I don't think that you need to always have some like eureka moment or something.
Yeah.
I think just realizing that that's your choice is awesome. And I guess what were some of the big lessons that you learned in your recovery process? Was there anything that still sticks with you today?
No, I mean, so much. I would say so much of I think a lot of my approach to life as an adult was molded around a lot of things that I learned there. I mean, I think there's so many different things we could talk about that come out of that. I think the thing that was making me think when you talked about, epiphany moments and, a lot of times personal change of any kind, whether it's pretty dramatic in that regard or it's a little bit more minor, I think it's easy to get caught up in thinking we should really be wanting to do it and it should feel good. And because there were a lot of days through there that it was like 51% of me wanted to stay clean and 49% didn't. But that was enough to get through that day. That got me to the days where it was 80-20 and 90-10. And so I think sometimes with personal change, we think that if we still really want to do the behavior we used to do, that maybe something's wrong or we're not doing it right. But I think that's just a normal part of change. It's hard to let go of things that have served you well, even if they no longer serve you well anymore.
That's a great point. How do you like stick with the days when you have 51%? Do you remember what you did in those days?
Sure. I mean, I think yeah, I do know I stayed really close to things that were good for me. So in recovery, the structure of the recovery that I got involved in was a lot of meetings. So there's multiple meetings every day in any city. There's probably 1,000 of them a month in Columbus. And so the days that I was really struggling, I would just go to a few of those meetings in one day, just not let myself be alone with those thoughts. Or I would call people and I would tell them how I was feeling and I would ask for support, or I would read something that might shift my brain towards that 51%. And I don't think that's all that different than any kind of behavior or habit change, right? I think we need some degree of accountability. We need some degree of support. We need some degree of inspiration and motivation. We need all those different things. I think it's when those days are hard, it's getting back to what that original motivation is and getting support from other people.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I know, same for me when I just am able to talk with people who get where I want to be. It's so nice to have that accountability and those cheerleaders in your moments of weakness. So that's really helpful. I'm also curious about your podcast. So you mentioned, as I said before, you started this podcast, No Money, No Audience. I saw that you launched it January 6th. Today is what, February 6th. It's been exactly 13 months. Best of 2014 on iTunes. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, absolutely. So can you tell me about how you got started with podcasting and why you think it did so well, your podcast?
Sure. I mean, I got started because I just got interested in it, which tends to be the thing that I follow most in my life. Like, what am I interested in? And I tend to try and explore those things. So the podcast was just another variation on that. I don't quite remember how I got interested in it. And then I remember one day I just had the idea for the show, what it could be. I was like, that's a great idea. And my partner in the podcast, Chris, he's my best friend, and he does audio stuff. And I was like, I could get Chris involved. And we'd spend more time together, and we just jumped in and started.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because the barrier to entry, as you know, is pretty low, right? You want to have a podcast, all you got to do is do the work to have a podcast, and there you go. From there, it gets a little bit trickier, but the second part of your question was, how were we so successful? And I don't really know the answer to that. I think some of it is luck, but I think luck tends to, what's that old saying, luck comes to the prepared or something like that. And, I think one of the reasons we got successful is somebody at iTunes really liked what we were doing. If we hadn't made a good show, that wouldn't have happened, but there's lots of good shows that doesn't happen for. I only feel partially responsible for maybe that external success. We put ourselves in the best place we could. Something good happened, but I think there's a certain degree of luck in that.
Absolutely. And I don't think that this is what happened to you, but just as a side note, because I found this really interesting, I was talking to Jordan Harbinger, who I saw you interviewed too.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that he has a contact at iTunes where every time he wanted to be on the front page, he would just call them and he would just say, who do I need to talk to in order to be on the front page? Who would you like to see? And so one time they were like, Robert Greene. And he's like, okay, cool. And he interviewed Robert Greene and there he was.
It's interesting. I think there is some degree of the people on iTunes are just people like anybody else, right? And if you know them or they like what you're doing, I think these days there's so many podcasts, it's getting harder and harder for that stuff to happen. But we've been out like 3 weeks, or maybe it was like a month or something. And I went to the front page, and they had one of those smaller boxes they have down below featuring our show. I was like, oh my God. And then I got an email from one of them saying, we really love what you're doing, and would you like to be featured? And I was like, of course.
No,
Right?
I wouldn't.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that was very helpful in, certainly helpful in growing the numbers and helping establish a certain degree of credibility. But those things kind of come and go. It comes, it goes. And then the rest of the time is a matter of doing what everybody else does, which is putting out a good show and trying to spread the word and get people interested.
Absolutely. I'm curious, just as a fellow podcaster, but do you find that your numbers remain pretty consistent? Like your download numbers? Yeah.
I mean, we've been featured on the front page of iTunes. And so while we're featured, we see a definite bump. And then after the feature is over, that kind of comes back down, but it's still a little bit higher than it was before we got featured. The Best of 2014 made a pretty substantial difference that has remained with us. I think we picked up a lot of listeners at that point. But yeah, my listens stay pretty consistent week after week. I mean, I could predict them within, a certain amount, usually by day, which days of the week are more busy than other days. And they tend to stay pretty consistent, a slight growth, except for, like I said, when you get some big, iTunes featuring you, or we got to put on a Huffington Post article. And so we saw a little spike after that.
Yeah, I saw that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for people listening, can you explain just the concept of your show, just what the title means?
Sure. The show is called The One You Feed, and it's based on an old parable that goes like this. There's a grandfather who's talking with his grandson. He says, in life, there's two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandson stops and he thinks about it for a second, and he looks up at his grandfather and he says, Grandfather, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. So the show is based on that parable, and it's an interview podcast like yours where I have people on and I ask them what that parable means to them in their life and their work. And then we just kind of explore themes around that. I mean, the subtag of the show, or the second line, is conversations about creating a life worth living. So that's basically the focus, is how do you make a better life for yourself? How do you feed those parts of you that are positive, and try not to feed as much the parts of you that are negative or cause you pain?
Awesome. So exactly what you were saying with the 51%, 49%.
That parable, I mean, I first heard it in recovery, and for people who are battling something like that, it's a very easy, very clear parable. It speaks very directly to the day-to-day battle. But I think it speaks to everybody. That's why almost everybody, when they hear the parable, goes like, oh yeah, like that makes total sense. I think that we all are minute by minute, day by day, making the thoughts and decisions that affect the quality of our life. And either we're doing that consciously, or we're doing it sort of, unconsciously, and the quality of our life really is determined by those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they say that no decision is still a decision.
Exactly.
So if I asked you, just first thing that comes to your mind, one of the biggest lessons that you learned from your podcast, it could be with a guest or maybe through something that you just kind of really embodied or took on when you were creating one of your mini episodes, what would that be? What comes to mind?
I think the biggest overarching theme, I would say, for me, is the idea of being aware of what our thoughts are and what our behavior and our actions are. It's very easy for me. I just call it going on autopilot, where I just kind of go through the days day by day, and I'm mostly doing what I should, but I'm not paying any close attention to the things I'm thinking, the behaviors I'm doing. And so if I'm not even aware, like you said, that not making a decision is the same thing as a decision, or if I'm not aware of it, then I can't do anything about it. So awareness is a big one for me. Aware of what are the voices in my head, what are the stories I'm telling myself about life. Those are all so critical, and all that tends to fly under the radar of awareness for most of us most of the time. So I think for me, I've just gotten more and more clear on how important it is to try and be aware of those things. And once I'm then aware, I can make a lot of different decisions based on what's important to me.
Yeah, listening to your podcast, I've noticed many times where I feel like And this is actually one of the things I wanted to talk about, but you were talking about, for example, when you have negative thoughts and how
Hmm.
sometimes it can be like you want to emotionally and mentally bypass them and that doesn't feel good or different things where it's just like, or you also mentioned about, what was the specific example? Something happened to you that wasn't very good and you said, I just need to feel crappy for a bit. And then just kind of the distinction when you're ready to move on. I just feel like you're a very aware person. So I can see you're really getting that lesson.
Yeah, that is such a tricky thing, and I keep asking like everybody on the show. I think the other lesson of, I think we've done 61 interviews now, is that I sort of always have had this suspicion, but I've gotten more and more clear on it as you talk to people. Like, there aren't easy answers to a lot of these things. If the question is, well, I know that I need to feel my feelings to some degree, but I don't want to wallow in them, and I know I should be thinking positively, but I don't want to be a Pollyanna. Where's that line? The answer is, you got to figure it out. Like, there's nobody who can come and tell you that. I think that's what I keep asking. I keep on the show going, well, maybe somebody will unveil the magic secret, right? And there isn't one.
Yeah, it is really hard to know when you're done feeling something. So actually, let's just dig into this negative thoughts. So first of all, there are two concepts that you mentioned that I'd love to, just if you could explain for the audience listening what they mean to you. So first, rumination. Can you explain that?
Yeah, rumination is the just thinking about the same thing over and over again, but those thoughts not progressing in any way. So worrying is a great case of rumination. At a certain point, worrying is not by itself a bad thing, because we do need to think about situations in our life that are troubling. What should I do about X, Y, and Z? But at a certain point, for a lot of us, and certainly for me, I just now am in the same thought circle on it, and nothing is changing, and I just keep spinning around that same thing, and it's usually a negative thought of some sort or the other.
How do you break out of rumination? What are some of your best tips?
I think some of the best tips, so one of the things I think about rumination is interesting is that there's an idea that that's negative thinking, and so if I'm thinking negative, I should just think positively. And that doesn't seem to work for me. That rumination has so much momentum in some ways that I can't just go, oh, I'm going to think happy things. The world is great, and I'm a lovable person. And because before I know it, my mind is right back into that trap. So the biggest thing for me is I have to give my brain something else that it can hold on to. And sometimes the best answer is any kind of distraction is fine for me, because I think that rumination it can become so poisonous, because there's that idea that the more we think about something, the easier it becomes to think about it. I mean, neuroscience kind of points that out, that, neurons that fire together wire together. The more you think a thought, the easier that thought comes again and again. And so sometimes I just want to stop that thought process. I want to stop, walking that same trail. So distraction is a good one. But the other thing that I found is anything that's a mental challenge for my brain. So my very favorite one is it combines sort of positive thinking with the mental concentration, and it's called the alphabet gratitude game. You start with the letter A and you try and think of something you're grateful for, and then you go to the letter B and then the letter C. And what works so well for me about that is that it's a challenge to think those things through. So my brain is really engaged, and when my brain's engaged, that seems to be the way to get it out of the rumination. And yet at the same time, I'm sort of subtly feeding it things to feel better about.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that alphabet gratitude. I was actually going to ask you about it. I remember I was listening to your episode and it was like, A, you're grateful for being alive, and D is the name of your dog, right?
Yeah, I can't remember what A is. Couldn't have been grateful to be alive. I would have, alive, yes, alive could have been that one. Yeah, B, Beansy's my dog. She shows up for B often.
Yeah, I think that's such a cool, it's just fun, right? Like it brings out the kid in us.
Yep. And the other one that is fun sometimes too is just to think of a song you love that begins with each of those letters and try and get the tune in your head. But all it really is just some way to stop that same thought. It is not doing any good anymore. If you've got some more things to figure out on it, keep thinking about it. But for most of us, we go well past that mark.
After you play the alphabet gratitude or you play with songs, I mean, I'm sure that thought comes back again, right? So do you just keep distracting yourself?
I mean, I think it depends what it is, right? It's interesting because distraction is not in general considered a good thing, right? We don't want to distract ourselves from things in our lives that are important. It depends what I'm bothered about. If it's something that, for example, sometimes we have a situation in life and we're upset about it and we think about it and we know what we're going to do about it, but we're not going to be able to do that thing for 24 hours. the tendency is to just spin on it for that whole 24 hours. And that's where distraction can actually be useful, because I know what I'm going to do about it. I just have to get to the point where I can do it, or I can take that action. There's other times we don't know what's the matter. It's helpful to spend some time digging further into that. But when I think about rumination, for me, there's usually a very anxious component to it. And we're not good problem solvers when we're anxious. We're not good at understanding what's happening when we feel nervous or anxious or scared or angry. When there's a strong emotional component, a lot of times distraction is the best thing to get that emotional thermometer back down to a level that we can look at what's really happening around us. And so that's where I think it can be really helpful. Usually it's good enough for me that I do that, and my mind changes. And then the other thing is, what am I supposed to be, where am I, and what am I supposed to be doing? If I'm at work, I can get back to work. If I'm at home, I can get back to spending time with the kids, or I can get back to what I'm supposed to be doing instead of just being stuck in that negative thought pattern. So those are, I think of them more as interrupters versus permanent solutions.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking, even just yesterday, my boyfriend just sent out an email, and basically we're in, I guess, the short version is dealing with lawsuits. And it's this whole crazy thing, and he sent out an email telling his list about it. And he just got hundreds and hundreds of replies yesterday, and it was very emotionally taxing for both of us, just to see just everyone having questions, or just being, even if it was just being supportive, it was just a lot of energy coming in. And so both of us were feeling exhausted, and I just decided to take a minute to watch New Girl, just a funny show. It makes me laugh, and I just watched it 30 minutes, and it was like, boom, I can approach the day all over again. I feel way better. So sometimes it's even, I think, just a matter of like, what would bring me pleasure in this moment to get out of that.
Exactly. I think that's why I was saying sometimes any kind of distraction works, particularly a distraction you enjoy. The danger for us just comes when distraction is our permanent mode. We're always distracted from how we're feeling, but I need to take time to recharge, to do something that I find enjoyable, to relax. I think that's critical.
Absolutely. So the other question that I had about the definitions, mental and spiritual bypassing, can you explain what that means?
I got the term spiritual bypass from Christine Hassler, who wrote a book, and she was on the show. I didn't have a better word. Can't remember what I used to call it, but her term is better. But the idea is that something happens in life, and we immediately go into trying to bypass the feeling of it. So, for example, I think maybe the mini episode you listened to, I was talking about a situation in which I felt rejected and kind of hurt by something. Immediately when I felt it, my thought was, well, it doesn't really matter, or what will be, or all these different things that are sort of designed to make me feel better and bypass the emotional piece there. Anything that I can do that is, I should let it go, or all these things we tell ourselves, versus sometimes, an emotion is telling us something, and there's something to be felt there. And so the spiritual and mental bypass is simply trying to get around feeling that emotion. And my experience is that avoiding those emotions long enough, they tend to fester, and they show up in some way that we're not particularly happy to see. And so for me, I found a lot of times that if I just let myself feel that emotion, I feel it, maybe I feel crappy for a minute, 10 minutes, an hour, I don't know, but then it tends to pass, and it feels like it's really gone, instead of me trying to keep talking myself out of why it's a bad thing. And that's where I run into some trouble with positive thinking, is it seems like it's always trying to tell ourselves how everything that happens is wonderful, even when underneath it, our core emotional feelings are going, no, it's not. It's not good. I think to deny that can be damaging.
I agree, and that's actually the episode where I really tuned into how aware you are. And you're totally right. For me, after the lawsuit happened, everyone was pretty much like, this sucks, it's not fair, whatever. But there were a couple people that were, what is this teaching you? Why is this happening for your highest good? And it's just like, screw that, I don't want to hear it right now.
And the truth is, I don't believe that everything happens for the best. That's not a belief I have. But I do believe that we can make the best out of any situation that happens. Any situation that happens to us, we can find meaning and growth in, but that doesn't mean that we wanted it, or that it's good, or it is what it is and we have to deal with it. Sometimes things just suck. There are terrible things happening to people in the world right now as we talk. mean, just god-awful things that would make us all sick to our stomach. I mean, that's just the reality. And I think it's arrogant to say to those people, like, well, it's for your, I mean, it's callous.
Exactly. That's actually the whole tagline to this show. If you have a choice, choose a better life. I say that because, I mean, and I've said that to people, and people have said, well, everyone has a choice. But no, not really. Like when there's people being sex trafficked and all these things against their will, they don't have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, or their choices are very, very limited. I mean, we do have some degree of control in what we think, but people who have got a lot of time to think about how they think and how they feel are probably, life is probably going relatively well on a surface level.
Yeah, totally. Great point. Something else that I was curious about is I checked out your Twitter profile and you had decision making in your bio. I was just curious if you could let us know a little bit about how you make decisions.
Decision making it's something I'm interested in. I think it's one of the fundamental things that sort of defines the direction our life goes. And so there's a couple things I think about when I think about making good decisions. One is widening my perspective. We tend to sometimes get into should I leave my job and start a new company, or should I just stay with my new job? Well, a lot of times there's 1,000 options between those two. But we don't tend to see it that way. We tend to think it's widening my options. What are my other options? Well, maybe I don't quit my job today, but I start spending an hour every morning doing this other thing that I want to do. And we build from there. And I think that's the other part of decision making, is that we can make small decisions that move us along in the direction we think we want to go. And then we're getting valuable data as we go. It says, do I want to do this? Oh, okay, I started doing that and I realized, God, I hate writing. So maybe I shouldn't quit my job and be a blogger, right? So widening perspective. I think the other is, like I said, that those small decisions that move you along. And then the other piece of widening perspective also is a question I like to ask myself a lot with something is, will I care about it in 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? When I start to think of each decision in those various time frames, I can get a lot clearer on, okay, what do I want to do? And a lot of times realize, like, I am making a mountain out of a molehill, right? Like, I'm not even going to know next week. This decision is going to be irrelevant in a week from now. And so then I don't put so much pressure on the little decisions and just make them.
Yeah, I have always loved that perspective of just like, is it going to matter in whatever it is? Because it is true, like how much we're usually just making something such a big deal that really isn't.
I'm sorry. The one other thing I would add to that is we interviewed a guy who's the founder of Coach.me. It used to be the app called Lyft. And we had a great conversation about the idea of decision fatigue, or he calls it sort of your mental capacity. And the simple analogy he used is the one of Steve Jobs, right? He always wore a black turtleneck. So in the morning, he didn't have to make any more decisions. And that one, I think we all hear that one a lot. And it's kind of, maybe it makes some sense, but it's a little bit trivial. But there are other things that we all do that we could do that would allow us to make a lot less decisions. Like, what time do I get up every morning? Should I get out of bed now? No. What about now? And so I've made 50 decisions before I've even gotten out of bed. Or am I going to the gym today or am I not? Well, now I got to think about that. What am I doing if I go to the gym? So the more that some of those things become habits or routines, as much as that word, some people don't like that word, but when some of those things become that way, then we have more energy to think about and make good decisions in the areas of our life that do need more of our decision-making power.
Yeah, it's a muscle. Jordan, is actually the last episode that we just published. He was talking about how, for him, I don't know if you guys covered this in your podcast, but he talked about how he schedules out every single 15-minute chunk of his life. Did you guys talk about that?
We didn't. That's a lot of scheduling.
That's a lot of scheduling. I think it's a bit too much for me, but he said that he says if it's not on this calendar, it's dead to him. And
I'm sure his girlfriend loves that one.
I thought that was so funny, but he was saying the same thing about just the decision, like, am I going to go to the gym today? Am I not going to go to the gym today? Well, if it's in the calendar, you're going to go. And there's some, for sure, truth to that. I like scheduling the workouts, or even it used to be every morning I go and I make a smoothie for my boyfriend and we have different smoothies, and mine keeps me full for many hours, but Don, he usually wants something to eat very soon after. And so it would be, for a while, it would be hard for me to get into my work because I didn't know when he was going to be hungry. And so it's just like, gosh, so now it's just, I've just set it so that now I'll make him a smoothie, I'll get 60 minutes of work time, and then I'll go make him breakfast. And we both agreed on that. And it's crazy how simple that sounds, but just how helpful it is.
It really is. It's those small little things. I don't think we realize how much energy and brain power they take from us trying to sort of keep all those balls in the air.
Absolutely. So what does your routine look like?
Well, as someone who advocates a strong routine, I don't really necessarily always have one. In general, my routine during the day looks like I get up pretty early, I take a shower, I get boys, and I wake one of them up who's got to be at school early, and then I take him to the bus stop, I drop him off, I go meditate, and then I go to the gym, and then I start working. So that's the routine I like. Some days, though, if I'm traveling, that gets a little bit different. If he doesn't have school that day, or we have to be there early. But in general, that's the routine I like. And then on the weekends, I like to get up, and there's a couple different places here in town that I can go meditate at, like with other people, which I find to be a nice way to break that up a little bit.
Cool. There was another thing that I saw also on your Twitter profile that I was curious about, was you mentioned that when it comes to spirituality, it's depth, not breadth. Can you explain about that?
Sure. I think that in today's world, it is very easy to consume a lot of information about a lot of different things, but not really know how to put any of those things into action. And so knowing something is not the same as it being useful in our lives. And so what I mean by that is I don't need another blog post about how to meditate, or I don't need another blog post about the benefits of meditation, or I don't need a blog post about what celebrities are meditating, right? What I need is just to sit down and do it. And so many things in our lives are that way that it's easy to just keep gathering the information, instead of taking the little things we know and really doing them and doing them consistently. So that's mostly what I mean by that, is let's take what we know, the things that we have, and put them into action and try and integrate them deeper into our lives so that they are something that we feel and believe versus something we read.
I just saw some quote that blew my mind. It was something from one of the co-founders of Google, and it was something like, I think every minute there's more information that becomes available than all of the information that was available until 2003.
That's it. I know, it's insane. It's just, it kind of boggles the mind, and I think it's so easy to get swept away with it. It takes a really strong thought process and discipline to realize, like, I don't need to see all that. I don't need to consume all that information. We had one of our early guests is a guy named Todd Henry. He runs a website called The Accidental Creative, and he wrote a book called Die Empty about sort of not dying with your best work inside of you. But I asked him, give me one thing that we can walk away with. And what he said was, spend an hour. So if you read for an hour, spend an hour thinking about, writing about how you're going to integrate what you learned into your life. If you just make that one switch, your life would be totally different. And for most of us, that ratio is so far off. It's like 95% I'm consuming, I'm reading a blog, and 5% am I really working on how am I going to integrate that into my life. I could sit down some morning and start going through all these different blogs and reading all these things, and they could all be really great pieces of information, but I bet you at the end of the hour, I could barely tell you anything that I read, because it's just one after the other. It's that addictive, okay, that was good, give me another, okay, little. And so I think that integrating these things into our life, because we will never keep up with the information flow at this point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When I was starting marketing, there's a marketer called Jason Fladley, and I was reading one of his reports, and he said he recommends having a 2-to-1 at least action ratio. For every 1 hour you spend learning, you spend 2 hours in action.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's really, really great. And I found also when I first started marketing, I was doing things on my own and I was trying new things that I hadn't seen before. And I actually did amazing when I started online. Like from my very first day, I was making between $500 to $800 a day for months. And I ended up getting on all these different marketing lists and learning about all these different things. And what happened was I just have all these like air quote better ideas, and my income just plummeted. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's just so much to be said for just taking action and following your own intuition and not getting inundated with other people's stuff.
That is I think so many people run into that challenge of too much gathering of information, too much trying to learn, and not enough doing it. And I think there's a bunch of reasons why that's easy for us to fall into, but the bottom line is we have to try and work against it.
Absolutely. Well, Eric, this has been so fun. I really like talking to you, and I think that you've given so much just spectacular stuff for people, especially like in a very just real, tell it like it is kind of way, which is super helpful. So thank you so much. And can you let people know where they can go find out more about you and your podcast?
Sure, if you just go to oneyoufeed.net, and that's all spelled out. It's ONEYOUFEED.net. So oneyoufeed.net.
All right, spectacular. Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me on. It was fun.
Thank you so much for listening to A Better Life. You can find all show notes for this episode at rachelrofe.com. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe so you can automatically get access to all new shows. Let's also connect. Just go onto Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram /RachelRofe, and we can talk there. The opinions of all guests here are their own, and I'm not necessarily endorsing any of them. I do want to give you perspective, though. And always remember,